I remember when I was in Amsterdam, and I heard that Berry Place had this new sannyasi, had just arrived in Berry Place, and freshly initiated by Srila Prabhupada, and somehow I had a feeling to go, had to get to Berry Place to meet this person. I just knew I'd have something to do with him, and when he came to Berry Place, I know he really inspired all the devotees. Every night, anyone who was at Berry Place at the time, this was 71, 72, everyone would just rush for the evening kirtan and the lecture, because they knew that this particular devotee was going to be giving the lecture. Srila Prabhupada said to him personally at the time, "Your college preaching program is my dream, and my dream come true." I remember one event, 1972, Kensington Town Hall. Prabhupada gave this incredible lecture, and then a born-again Christian stood up at the back and said, "What about Jesus?" And Prabhupada just looked at the man, quite disgusted, couldn't believe he actually stood up and said it. And then he just looked over at this devotee and he went. And that devotee stood up, he did his obeisances, Bandeham Shri Guru. And even at the beginning of the event, I was stood at the back looking at him with his dunda, and I was thinking, he looks like a gunslinger or something, you know. And when he stood up, I thought, this man's going to get it real bad. He's going to get it so bad. When he started to do that Bande arms, oh, he's had it. This guy's really had it. Whoa. Anyway, he did have it, and at the end, everyone stood up, gave this devotee a standing ovation. The next day on the morning walk, Srila Prabhupada said, "I want you all to learn how to preach like this devotee." So we all know him. If you were there in the early 70s, I think made many of you a devotee, I think. Yeah? Many of us were made devotees by this person, gave us great faith in Krishna. So let's welcome Revatinandana Prabhu.
Hold it. Oh, you got it? Okay. Haribo Prabhus. It's wonderful to see you all the last couple of days. There's an expression, he's a hard act to follow. So Guru Das talked about 5 of the 6 devotees who established the yatra, but he left himself out. One time I heard Srila Prabhupada refer to Guru Das, "Oh, Guru Das, yes, he is a big sweet ball." There were times along the way when I was a brahmachari, when we were in India. I was having a health problem one time that was causing me sore distress. I didn't know I'd only been a couple weeks in India. We weren't all the best looked after brahmacharis. It was a new adventure to just be in India, and I had a problem, and I didn't know where to turn. And I didn't know Guru Das very well, but of all the people there, I could just tell that he would help me. He'd been to India before. Guru Das brought me to the doctor, right? And he paid for it and everything because I was a penniless brahmachari. And I just remember that he's such a kind person. He mentioned the special qualities, and it's a fact that the 6 devotees that established this yatra all had some uniquely special qualities. And I think warmth and compassion are 2 ways to describe Guru Das Prabhu that don't quite measure up, but we'll try with that for a start. They want us to be kind of brief, and we're going to have everyone talk today, so I'm going to you know me. And so what Bhumadev was talking about Kensington Town Hall, he doesn't know what I went through that night. Because you see, it was Prabhupada's lecture. When the man asked the question, Prabhupada made a face. And he said, "I do not want to answer this question." He said it kind of under his breath. And then he looked at me and said, "Revatinandana Maharaj, you answer." Well, of course, I hadn't expected to be speaking that night. And when I went Bandeham Shri Guru, it wasn't quite the same mood that Bhumadev caught. I had a complete blank in my mind. I did not know what I was going to say as I walked up to the microphone. And all I could think of was, Prabhupada has asked you to do it. You have to do something. You have to trust Krishna. And the words came out probably better than as well as I've ever spoken. And it worked out very nicely because the intelligence came on the spot, as if upon demand from, well, this is something that I thought of as you said that, if for a couple minutes, just to make one brief point to everyone, is that we have an institution, and in an institution there is a form, a structure that has grown up, which we call ISKCON, or the Krishna Consciousness Movement, but it's made of innumerable individual devotees. And the wonderful thing about Krishna consciousness is that it's a very personal thing. Each one of us is a very special person, and each one of us has the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is the most special person, sitting in our heart all the time. Because in the beginning, we're not completely pure at heart. At first, we need an external guide who is actually a manifestation of that Supreme Person, and that's how we appreciate our spiritual master. And devotional service to Lord Krishna is actually a process of, it's a very individual process of spiritual growth, whereby if we take on some responsibility, whatever comes to us. Oh, I have to somehow or other get this prasadam preparations cooked, or I have to see to it that the hall is booked for a program, or whatever our service may be. There's so many things that come to us. It may be something like that day for me when I had no idea how I could possibly suddenly step in and substitute for Srila Prabhupada, right? And all I could do was trust the Super Soul to give me the words, and they came flowing out of my mouth, and I didn't even know where they were coming from. Actually, whenever I speak, it's always been pretty much like that. That was just an exceptionally vivid example to me. I remember I just marveled at it afterward. I just felt really humble and really lucky. And I've had that feeling many, many, many times. I felt really, really lucky to be here in the British yatra during the early 70s because of the incredibly bright faces. Prabhupada used to say, my disciples are bright faces, and I never saw such bright faces as the ones that used to dance before Radha Landanishwara at Seven Berry Place every night during our evening program. The young ladies and gentlemen who had become Vaishnavas were so joyful. They were so ecstatic. They had such nice, humble service attitudes. All over the world, devotees are nice. Somehow or other, if you take a rather genteel and civilized country like Britain, and then you take their Vaishnavas, well, they have such nice material qualities, and then when they're lit up with spiritual life, they become exceptionally appealing devotees, and I always felt really pleased with my companionship while I was in England. My business was to teach at that time. That was my assignment, but I always felt like everybody was simply bringing me out, and that my pupils were my teachers all the time here, because they all had such good qualities that I could always take inspiration from. So if there's any bit of advice I could give to a devotee, I would say this. Try to take on what you can for Krishna as you chant Hare Krishna, because chanting Hare Krishna is our spiritual strength. It purifies our heart. The more pure we are at heart, the more we can get a little inspiration from within as we serve our external guide, who is our spiritual master. And the more we expand our responsibility, the more we will make ourselves eligible to receive inspiration from the Super Soul within our hearts. And ultimately, it's a combination of the external guru and the internal guru that will take us back to Godhead in that way. So, you're all such wonderful, big-hearted devotees, and I just wish you all the best of good fortune in expanding your service in that way, and continue to be joyful. So, Hare Krishna. All I recall after is that Prabhupada, the kirtan ended, and Prabhupada put on his spectacles, and he had what I'm sure must have been his own Srimad Bhagavatam in front of him. This was, of course, long before. This was, again, it was in early '68. It was long before he had actually translated any of it. But he was reading from it, and then he was speaking. And I remember noticing that as he spoke, a lot of times his eyes were closed, or if he was looking out, It was like basically just looking around the room. He didn't seem to be presenting himself or kind of advertising himself or trying to appear as a holy man like I had seen a couple other gurus around that were doing like that. And he seemed like he was very just, I remember noticing, he's just speaking this teaching right from this book, and then he's explaining it. I do recall specifically that in that particular lecture he remarked, so now they are saying that everyone is God. You are God, I am God. He said, so there are so many gods laying down in the street. Right? He said, so for you, God does not mean very much if you think that. He said, G-O-D-D-O-G. What is the difference? You say you are God, I say you are dog. But if we are all God and gods are laying down in the street, then what is the good is no different than being dog. And he talked about the opulences. And that's a paraphrase, obviously. It's not exactly what he said, but I remember that he specifically mentioned G-O-D-D-O-G. And I was going from one viewpoint to the other right at that time, and immediately it just struck me right away that that's right. You know, obviously, how has God gotten into such a bad spot as so many people like me that were practically almost living in the street at that time, or were living in the street in some cases? Cooking one day in the temple kitchen, mostly I was out on Sankirtan, but in this particular day I was helping cook a prasadam with Aniruddha. And Prabhupada, he came back in from seeing Prabhupada. He said, you know, Prabhupada just told me we're not supposed to use mustard seeds or mustard oil or fenugreek anymore in the cooking. He said, just don't use them in the temple cooking. Right? He wanted it kept basically simple spices and basically simple techniques, straightforward, you know, with the cumin seed, chili, asafoetida and the chaunts, etc. But he specifically mentioned about mustard seed and mustard oil as well as fenugreek. People don't know this. Later on in India, he remarked one time, my godbrothers, they generally prefer mustard oil, but I like ghee, he said. He gave a lecture, hopefully it is on tape somewhere, but he gave a lecture from the Vyasa-san, what was usually Bhagavad Gita class. He talked entirely, it might have been a Sunday afternoon lecture at a Sunday feast, it could have been. I believe it was light, daytime, and maybe it was late afternoon, but one way or the other way, he spoke specifically about kirtan. And he said things about kirtan that I never heard him say other times, particularly not during a lecture. He actually gave a full lecture. Mostly it was all about kirtan, chanting, and dancing. Some of the things he said at that time, he remarked that melodic instruments, including harmoniums, he said, are not meant for kirtans. I heard him say it a couple other times also. Specifically, he said harmoniums are not meant for kirtans. Melodic instruments in general are what he mentioned that day. He said, and he explained it. The only time I ever heard him explain it, he said that because the ear will naturally follow music. So as soon as there are musical strains, the ear will follow them automatically, right? And when the ear is following the music, the attention is divided from the mantra. He said rhythm instruments are good for kirtan because they make one more inclined to dance, and dancing in turn unlocks devotion. He liked graceful dancing, and he used to use Jayatirthas. He was a very graceful dancer. As he said, see how he dances, it is very good. This will help to feel more devotion. But anyway, that day he specifically said that rhythm instruments are good, but not melodic instruments. And another time, around that same time, he told Vishnu John one day, who was in his room, Vishnu John told me right afterward, that he did not like melodies that had long extended notes in them. Like we used to sing, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. He heard us singing that melody, and then right afterward he remarked to Vishnu John, don't do like that. He liked all the melody to be filled up with mantra. During the lecture that he gave that day, he said also don't harmonize during the response. In other words, the leader may sing little variations, but the group should sing basically a steady response, and that one person shouldn't be singing one melody and another melody during the response. Right? So these things, he said, that would help one to pay more attention to the mantra as one was chanting and dancing, and that way one would get the maximum benefit, and the kirtan would also become more ecstatic. He also said that the dancing should be graceful and gentlemanly. And then he came down from the Vyasasan during the second kirtan. It was the first time I ever experienced him dancing with us. He came down right in the middle of the kirtan party and danced with us. And, you know, first he held his hands like this, and he danced back and forth with what we call the Swami or the Prabhupada step or whatever you want to call it. And he did it very gracefully, you know. He'd kind of take a step into each way. He moved his foot back and forth. And then after a while, he put his hands up like this, and he started leaping up in the air. Up, up. Straight up and down, though, not shaking his body around, but with his hands up and just leaping right up into the air. And his hands were going like this as he went up. And he kept leaping and leaping and leaping. And we were doing it with him, and I got tired. And actually, I stopped and started to dance back and forth again at one point. And here I am, I'm what, 21, 22 years old at the time. I was 21 when I moved into the temple. I must have been about 22. And he was over 70. I think he was about 71 or something like that, or more than that, in his early 70s at the time. And Prabhupada went right on leaping for a long time during that kirtan. He seemed to have no physical exhaustion from it at all. And it really impressed me because I thought, here, I mean, I play basketball, right? And here this guy can jump more than I can. I shouldn't say guy, but I mean, that's the kind of thoughts that were going through my mind. I was just amazed. And it was the first time I'd ever seen him dance, and here he was right in the midst of us, and he was leaping and leaping for a long time during the kirtan. I had gotten up one morning so sick that I actually, I couldn't even make it. Somebody was in the outhouse, and I had to go behind the outhouse to relieve myself. I was that sick. And it was cold. It was very cold. We didn't expect it to be so cold because it was midwinter in northern India. And I'd given my sleeping bag to somebody in New York on the way over in exchange for an old suitcase. And so I wound up I was lucky to have a quilt to wrap up in that was warm enough. So I wrapped up again afterward. I couldn't get up for Hartik. And until I heard him chanting. And Prabhupada, I think, might have been leading the kirtan, or he was chanting. I could hear him because it was a microphone. I could hear his voice. So I got myself up, I got myself dressed, and I went into the pandal where Prabhupada was having the Mangal Arati kirtan at one end of it for the deities there and like that. And I remember him saying, he was talking about a jamil. And he'd been talking for some lectures about prayaschita, which means atonement procedures for atoning for sins. And he said the problem is that you atone, but you do not get the seed of sinful desire out, and therefore you do it again. So you have to go through the atonement again and again. So atonement is not the solution. One has to purify the heart. And then he was talking about how chanting does this, how it purifies and eventually cleanses even the seeds of sinful desire from the heart. He said, but then he said, and I never forget this, he said, but do not be impatient, he said. He said, after all, it took me 30 years to chant in this way. Right? And sometimes I thought he was giving those Ajamil lectures for me, because it might be my fate, I don't know. But one way or the other way, when he said that, it made a deep impression on me. Some people hypothesized that Prabhupada was this or that. He said a few things in India about his past life and things, and that day he said it took him 30 years to chant with the devotion that he did chant with, or the purity that he did chant with. So I always took it from his own words that he was a person who, well, later on in Calcutta, he said, one day he said, I don't know where he heard, maybe it was from an astrologer or from some other source, but Prabhupada said, in my previous life I was a doctor, and I led a sinless life. Therefore, I was able to take up devotional service seriously in this life. And that's how he described it. And then that day he described a little bit about his own devotional development, that he said it had taken him 30 years of chanting to reach the stage at which he was chanting, which was obviously with pure, ecstatic love. Prabhupada had once said in response to another question while I was in Calcutta that when one leaves one's body, having become a pure devotee, he goes to take another birth, but on the planet where Krishna is appearing. And he meets Krishna outside for the first time in another embodiment, but on the planet where Krishna is having his avatar. And then when Krishna leaves that planet, the devotee goes with him back to the spiritual sky for good. So actually, there's one more birth after one becomes a pure devotee, but it's not like a material birth, because it's a birth with Krishna where he's appearing in his pastimes, and then one goes to the spiritual Goloka with him at that time. Another time in India, he told me in his room in Calcutta, another time he said that, I asked him, because you're a devotee of Radha Krishna, does that mean we're all inherently devotees of Radha and Krishna? And he said, not necessarily. And I said, so we might also be devotees of, say, Lakshmi Narayan or Sita Ram? And he said, yes. I said, am I to understand that by doing this process, however, whatever our relationship with Krishna in any of his forms is, it will be uncovered? And he said, yes again. So he told me specifically that not every devotee would become ultimately attached. Because I was thinking about the story of Murari Gupta in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, whom Lord Chaitanya says, you are a pure devotee of Lord Ramachandra, that you're Hanuman, right? So not, so in other words, there are some devotees that are constitutionally attached to other forms of the Lord, but Radha Krishna contains all of those forms within. So we were in a spot that by purification we would find out what our relationship was going to be. At least that's what he told me in Calcutta. We stayed in a house for a while, and Prabhupada had an apartment, and Dayananda and Nandarani, Dayananda was a temple president actually, he had a bungalow. And for a while we were having kirtans in this bungalow, which was in a set, like, they were like bungalow motel, little hotel rooms sort of, but they were in a bungalow arrangement, and that's where Dayananda was living. And the place wasn't too much bigger than this room we're in right now. Just maybe only a few feet wider and about the same length, I believe. It wasn't really very big. And it would be like 30 or 40, more than 30, about 40 or even 45 of us packed into this little room with Prabhupada, including a couple of guests that we brought along or whatever. But mostly those evening Bhagavad Gita classes were just him sitting in a chair at one end of the room and the rest of us all packed in. I remember one time we'd just gotten new dhoti cloth, and it was just, it was like Dacron cotton, orange, or polyester. It was polyester cloth that we gotten from a store in LA by a big sheath, and we just cut dhotis out of it. And someone had sewed up some kurtas, so it was for the first time we had standard clothes to go out in the street. Otherwise it was the typical Hare Krishna ragamuffins on the street. Then we had all the same color dhotis, right? So we came to Kirtan that night, and Prabhupada was looking around, and then everybody was there, but Jayananda wasn't there. And Prabhupada looked up and he said, where is Jayananda? Not Jayananda, it was Jayananda. Where is Jayananda? And we said, well, he's still out parking the van, Srila Prabhupada. So Prabhupada waited until Jayananda came in the door. As Jayananda walked in, Prabhupada looked at him and smiled. He said, oh. He said, Jayananda looks just like Lord Chaitanya. And Jayananda blushed purple. He just blushed and blushed because he was really homespun, shy, humble, right? And when Prabhupada singled him out and glorified him like that, when Prabhupada was smiling as he said it too, Jayananda just blushed. Then he went in his room and he called Jayapataka in. And we were standing outside on the balcony, covered balcony at 3 Albert Road. And then Prabhupada, he went out of the temple into Prabhupada's room through a side door. So Prabhupada went in, called Jayapataka, and we were outside. Prabhupada practically roared at him. No, he said real brusquely, he said, why your complexion is greenish. And Jayapataka kind of stammered something like that. We were watching from outside, but not in the room. And then Prabhupada, he said, if you do not eat better, you will die. He said, these devotees, they are all looking like they are weak, he said. Right? You're not eating properly, he said. And then he said, you get so much every day. You send down for each devotee, you get so many portions of a kilogram of fresh-made curd. He said, go to the place where the sweet merchants buy curd that comes in from the countryside, and buy curd, so much for each devotee every day. Fry it with a little salt and asafoetida, he said, and give it to the devotees, right? That one thing. And basically, more of a more substantial kind of food. We were doing a lot of puffies and a lot of, just dal chapatis and puffies was not quite making it for us, And basically it was, Prabhupada really kind of came in and saved us immediately. He saw that there was practically malnourishment was setting in the temple at that time. Prabhupada came in the temple room. It was a nice kirtan. I remember Prabhupada remarking, so on one side there was blazing fire, and on the other side there was Radha and Krishna, because there was a nice Radha Krishna deities being worshipped really nicely. Jamuna was there, Kausalya, Chitralekha were taking, Devananda Swami were taking care of the deities. Lots of those little white flowers and champak garlands and and it smelled nice, and it looked pretty. It was very refreshing to see the deities there. And there was a window behind them, so light would come in, and sometimes black bees would come in and fly around the deities and land on a flower or two and then go out again. Prabhupada told, I think it was Kosalya or Jamuna, he said, when those black bees come, that is a good sign that Krishna is very pleased with the deity worship. But anyway, while he was on the Vyasa sound, I remember he said on one side there was a blazing fire, and he pointed like toward the street end of the building, because Calcutta's Calcutta. And on the other side there was Radha and Krishna. People do not know that there is an alternative, so we have to give them that alternative. I remember that. One day we were going to go over to one of the Gaudiya Math. There were several different Gaudiya Math ashram places in Calcutta, several maths, and we were going to one of them. And I knew that this particular math had a bookstore where they would have all kinds of the old Gaudiya Math publications, some of which are now quite rare, right? So Prabhupada and I were standing in the doorway of the Albert Road Temple, and I remember asking him, I said, Srila Prabhupada, I know that, I take it that your books are all we really need, but at the same time, I know that they're going to have several books here. For example, you told Bali Mardan once that if he read Brahma Sanghita, he'd become a very good preacher. I was wondering if it would be all right if I bought the Brahma Sanghita and any of the other books that they have to study, right? Since we're going to be going to this place. So Prabhupada looked at me, and he answered, and basically there were three parts to the answer. I'll see if I can remember almost exactly what he said. I'll try to be as close as I can on it. Of course, it was a long time ago, but I remember this very clearly. He said, for one thing, he said, I do not think that you will be able to understand these books very well. He said, my Guru Maharaj was not very pleased with the sincerity of most of his disciples. And he wrote his books in a very difficult language so that even almost none of his disciples could understand them. Then he said, and I think this is a direct quote, he said, actually, my Guru Maharaj wrote those books for me. Only I could understand them. Another thing he said at the same time was that he said anything published by the Gaudiya Math after 1932 we shouldn't read, because by that time political things were entering into the edited literatures that were being printed. And he said, don't read anything printed by Gaudiya Math after 1932. And I said, didn't your Guru Maharaj pass in 1936? He said, yes, but in the last 4 years he was infirm. And he was not directly supervising the printing anymore. Right? I mentioned that one time to some other devotees. Some of them had became connected with the Chaitanya Saraswat Math in the San Jose Center, and they denied that he could have said that. They said he couldn't have said that, because Bhaktisiddhanta lived until 1936. Right? It was about reading some other publications that I said, well, I'm not so confident about them if they were printed after 1932. It was a version of Jaiva Dharma, which of course by Bhaktivinoda, there's no problem with it, but there may have been some problem in the text. One way or the other way, that's what he said to me that day. And the final thing he said was, and besides that, he said, an intelligent disciple takes what his spiritual master provides for him as being sufficient for him. I believe it was in the spring. Well, it was in the year of 1975. I'm almost positive it was 1975 that Gurudas Prabhu took sannyas, which he maintained then for some time afterward. And it took place at the Stewart Street Temple in Berkeley. And Prabhupada gave a lecture that day that was a very nice lecture, and part of it was, which was amusing to me, is that he spoke just as highly, if not more highly, of Jamuna than he did of Gurudas. And at one point, referring to Jamuna, he said, and his wife, meaning Gurudas's wife, he said, and his wife, she is practically a sannyasini. So after the program was over, and Prabhupada was on his way back to his room, I was walking beside him, and I asked him if I could ask a quick question, and he said yes. And I asked him if it were conceivable, because I kind of had a premonition that it might come up someday. I asked if it was conceivable that someday women in our movement might formally take sannyas. Prabhupada looked at me. He made a very disgusted expression on his face. He went, Never. And he said it with more vehemence than I just put into it. It was an emphatic answer, and that's exactly what he said. From his point of view, that was not a possible situation. And I only put that here because I thought it has already now come up, and that was his opinion about, for the future, whether that would ever be a possibility. Another night, well, not the same night, but in the same bungalow, that had an especially hard day on the street, during the day. We went out twice a day. Daytime was downtown, nighttime was Hollywood Boulevard, and it was like about 5-hour stretch each time. So Vishnu John led kirtan 8 out of those 10 hours every day. So I would occasionally get to lead a little kirtan toward the end, but earlier I hadn't even learned how to lead kirtan yet. I was just starting to learn. But after I'd been out collecting for a long time, well, wait a second. It was hard, let's put it this way, it was hard for me to get out and do it. And one day especially, I was just feeling like I couldn't go on with it anymore. And I was thinking that as soon as I get a chance to just disappear, I'm going to leave. It just seemed too hard for me. I was tired. Some altercation had happened with one of the devotees a few days previously where he threatened me and like that. It was a little passionate. I don't want to mention any names. And I just decided, and that day I just didn't engage myself. Usually my 10 or 15 magazine sales were tops on the party, not because I was any good at selling, but just because I'd talked people into buying a magazine somehow, because it was all in dhotis and kurtas with cards. It wasn't, we knew no mantras and no sales techniques. It was all done very straightforwardly. The only person who could do more magazines was Tamal. Jayananda would go out and spend the whole day, do 3 or 4 magazines, because he was just so sincere, but he couldn't persuade people to buy something, you know. Whereas Tamal could put his arm around people and wheedle them and talk to them, and the next thing you know, they'd be buying a magazine. It was easy for him. For me, it was somewhere in between, but it was very straightforward, trying to preach, you know, but the people on the street weren't that intelligent, they weren't that interested, so it was hard to find. It was slow. But one day, I think I did 2 or 3 that day, and just didn't get into it on purpose. I thought, you're just not going to you're going to get out of here this time. And I hadn't had a chance to go anywhere. That night, I went over we were driven over to the bungalow, and Prabhupada was speaking, and I hadn't gotten into chanting during the first kirtan on purpose. I just didn't want to get carried away again. It was either one of Prabhupada's lectures or a feast would always wind up changing my mind to stay. And then, so as I say, Maya was really tugging at my mind, to use the Krishna terminology for it. So then Prabhupada was speaking, and I had my head down. And Prabhupada specifically said, I think he said, almost exactly, he said, so the symptom of Krishna consciousness, when one is engaged in devotional service, is that he will become jolly, he will become joyful. Right? If one is morose, that means he is not Krishna conscious. If one is in Krishna consciousness, he cannot be morose. And as he said that, I looked up at him, because it hit me hard. And I looked at him, and he was looking right at me. Specifically, his eyes, as I looked up, his eyes were right on me, right? And he was speaking to me at that moment. But I was so fragile psychologically at that point especially, that if he had singled me out, I would have probably ran from the room, or broke into tears, or gotten very agitated, angry even maybe, at that point, and left. And instead, he did it in the lecture. But when I saw it, when I looked up and he was looking me right in the eye as I looked up, I knew that he had seen exactly where I was at. And he said it just for me, and I knew he was right, because all day I had refused to engage myself, and therefore I'd been miserable all day. Then my legs hurt, then I was tired, then I was this and I was that. Or otherwise I'd get absorbed, and then time would pass, and little by little I was getting stronger. But things like that would happen periodically for different devotees. Prabhupada was very good at reading your face. He once said the face is the index of the mind, and he had that art down by training or intuition or both. But one way or the other way, he was very good at knowing what to say at a particular time, just to keep people from faltering, right, or to encourage them in different ways. There is one story that I'd like to relate. It happened in 1976. And as I'm trying to remember where it was, the physical setting, I'm not positive, but I think it was in Berkeley Temple around the same time that Guru Das took sannyas. But in any case, I had a chance to ask Prabhupada a question once. I had just heard a story. There was previously, in the mid-70s, Prabhupada had one of his Sanskrit scholar devotee assistants. His name was Nitai Das. And Nitai was a very academic devotee. And then he left ISKCON. He, as we said, blooped. And later on I asked some devotees what happened to him, and they said, oh, he left and went over to some Brijbasi Goswamis in Vrindavan. And now he's saying that Prabhupada is not giving us all the information we need because, for among other things, he's not telling us what our rasas with Krishna are, and what that was in reference to something called I think they refer to it now as the Siddha Pranali. The actual process was called taking an initiation called the Siddha Deha initiation, where one is told by the Guru what one's rasa is with Krishna and how to practice a certain sadhana in relation with one's own personal rasa. I have been told, although I haven't read it, I've been told that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati did not do it and said that it is not in our line. But in any case, Nitai did go over to that camp in Vrindavan, and then he criticized Prabhupada, and when I heard about that, I wondered about it. So subsequently, I had a chance to ask Srila Prabhupada a question, and as far as I can remember, again, I don't have the exact words, but I asked Prabhupada that if there are any matters concerning the nature of our devotional service and our relationship with Krishna that he has not personally explained to us or described to us, would it be necessary for us in the future to find out someone else to take more instruction from? Or could it be, as I thought, that if we were following his prescription for sadhana and for engaging in sankirtan and preaching and chanting, that by our chanting and our preaching and our service, as the heart became pure, Krishna would be able to reveal these subsequent things to us by revelation from within the heart. And when I said that latter part, he smiled and said, yes, that is the way. You will not have to go anywhere else, but if you simply follow my instructions, everything will be revealed to you from within. And he had a very pleased look on me for the way I phrased it in that way. So there was no doubt to me that he was very clear about answering that question, that there wasn't any need for being specifically instructed about these things about our rasa and like that, because in the pure heart, everything is revealed to a pure devotee. The Seattle temple Naranarayan was up there building an altar, and when it was built, right around that time, I remember Prabhupada gave a lecture one day in the evening, an evening class, and he mentioned a godbrother of his, he'd received a letter that a godbrother of his had just passed away. Don't remember, somebody else will know the name. It was one of the Tirtha Swamis in the Gaudiya Math, but it wasn't Bhakti Vilas Tirtha, who lived, of course, much beyond that. It was another one whose name was something Tirtha Maharaj. And Prabhupada said that this particular godbrother was very kind upon him, and had actually written him a letter while he was living in Vrindavan as a Vanaprastha, or Jhansi or Vrindavan. I forget where he said he was, but he said he received a letter from this godbrother reminding him that Guru Maharaj, meaning Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had wanted him to take sannyas and to preach, especially in the West. And this godbrother had written him a letter reminding him about that. And Prabhupada said, I did not want to take sannyas because it is a very difficult position materially. It's not easy to do, and I didn't want to do it. But this godbrother wrote me this letter at this time, and he said, and at the same time, right in the same days when I received this letter, he said, 3 times in succession, on 3 successive nights, he said, my Guru Maharaj appeared before me in a dream. And each time in the dream, he was walking away from me, and as he was walking away, he turned around and beckoned for me to follow. And he went like this. Right? And he had that dream 3 times. I believe he said 3 nights in succession, but definitely 3 successive times in a very short span of time. Right at the same time that externally the God brother had sent them this letter. And these things prompted him to take sannyas. What Prabhupada said specifically was, in this way, my Guru Maharaj pulled me out from this material world. And when he said pulled, 2 tears just literally suddenly formed and leaped out of his eyes and went then, and it was just like they were squeezed out by a shudder of ecstasy and went running down his cheeks. They hadn't formed slowly and dripped down like most tears do. As he said pulled, his voice got real thick as he said it, and tears came shooting out of his eyes. And everybody in the room was just speechless, right? Because we were all devotees or guests but mostly it was just devotees there. It was an evening program and during a weekday. And I was very much impressed at the amount of intense feeling that he had toward his Guru Maharaj calling him to take sannyas. While we were walking back one time, I remember I asked Srila Prabhupada, as we were walking side by side, I said, Srila Prabhupada, could I ask you this? This is not a judgmental question, because whatever you eat, I'll eat with you and feel like it's what I should be eating, and it's Mahaprasadam for me. But I don't think that the food that we're getting fed here is really being offered to Krishna. They have a Krishna deity in there, but you can't tell him from the other deities, and they don't make any discrimination. And how should we view eating like this? And Prabhupada looked at me and he said, now I'm putting this out now because I feel like some of these things, at least they should be on record, even though, well, I'll tell you what happened. He said, actually, he said, everything is prasadam. And so a Vaishnav, if he takes anything, he simply takes it as the mercy of the Lord. Right? But we prefer to eat what is offered to Radha and Krishna. But otherwise we understand everything to be the mercy of Krishna. He said, but do not preach like this, he said. And I said, why is that? And he said, because the new devotees, they will take food simply as sense enjoyment unless they offer it first. And so we do not want to confuse them. And that, as I thought about it, I was smiling on the way back because I always thought that's the difference between how an Uttama Adhikari sees things and when he comes down to the level of a Madhyama Adhikari to preach. It was the first time I saw a clear-cut example of that, which I saw many times later on, as I saw how Prabhupada had his priorities and like that, but that was the first time. I remember again, there was plenty of time, he was talking, he was letting us ask questions. And so I asked him a question at one point. I said, Prabhupada, it says that in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it says at one point that the 14 different grades of planetary systems are arranged along the stem of the lotus flower. And I said, I had always envisioned that they would be from Brahmaloka, and there's a lotus flower stem that comes down to the navel of the, which one is that? That's the Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, the second Vishnu, Garbhodakashayi Vishnu. He's supposed to be in each universe, it's supposed to be filled halfway with water, and then from his navel it says that a lotus stem comes, and on top of the lotus is Brahmaloka. And that the rest of the planetary systems are arranged, it says, along the stem of the lotus flower. I said, I had always envisioned them like we put them in pictures, we put them out in space kind of around Brahmaloka, but here it says that they're along the stem of the lotus flower. I said, how can that be? Because they appear to be in all directions. And Prabhupada looked at me, and he went like this. He smiled, he went, well, it may be a very big lotus flower. Then he shook his head a little bit and he said, but we cannot understand these things with our puppy brains. And he smiled. And I just put my head down and smiled because it hit me immediately that I'm trying to conceive of all these things, but I have a very small scope, right? And then when he said that, it was a nice point of revelation. I remember one day we went from Mr. Jariwala's house to an engagement at an industrial facility outside of Surat, where the company had invited us to come for their employees, and we did an engagement. It was a nice place. I remember there were bougainvillea bushes growing around the place and palms, and there was grass behind the industrial facility, which wasn't a heavy factory. I don't know what they made there, but anyway, Prabhupada it was a kirtan and lecture and kirtan program. And on the way back, our host that day wanted to show us a new Durga temple that had just been constructed by the side of a river there. And I forget the name of that particular river, but it flows through, that's Gujarat province. Surat's in Gujarat. We've gone from Maharashtra, where Bombay is, up into Gujarat. And by this nice stream, there was a really nice new Durga temple built, and it had a new deity in it. And it was one of those temples where they were taking care of the deity and like that. And I remember specifically Prabhupada telling us as we went in to do just like he did. And he said, when I bow down, I'm going to bow down with my right-hand side toward Mother Durga, right, toward the Durga deity. Now, normally when we bow with our left side, because usually, it's not this way in the LA temple, but usually the Vyasasana is to the right, or the Guru is said to be we're supposed to be bowing to our Guru, and it puts our left side toward the deity. So when you bow to a demigod, you should bow and offer respects, but you do it by offering to your Guru. The deity is on your right and Krishna is on your left. And that's how you'll be thinking as you offer obeisances to your spiritual master before the demigod. They're also serving Krishna. They will accept this as respect, right? One evening, he said he wanted to have a feast for the Gita Press people. He said they have been sheltering us and feeding us, so we will cook for them. And I got to cook it. Well, actually, our cooks made sabji and puris, and I made a chutney and halava, which I made with milk. Right? Later on, Prabhupada said it's Parsi halava, it's first class, but that was later. One way or the other way, I cooked in the afternoon, then everyone came to the program. I remember in the afternoon, Prabhupada asked what I was going to make as a chutney, and I said apple. And he went, I do not think apple chutney is very nice. Make tomato, or something like that. I said, well, Prabhupada, they already purchased the fruit, so we already have the apples. He said, all right, he said, but I do not, apple chutney. So anyway, so I thought, well, I'll do the best I can. It was already, because it was like 20 rupees for the apples or something like that. They were not common, right? Anyway, putting that aside now, the program went on. At this program, Prabhupada, for example, a couple days earlier, and throughout that week, Prabhupada had been teaching us, he had a copy of Bhaktivinod's songbook that he'd just been given. And he was teaching us Jai Radha Madhava in the morning by having us repeat it after him. Right? He took a special liking to that particular song, and that's when he began to sing it before his morning class. That's when it started. And he was teaching it to us by repeating one line at a time and having us repeat it after him. Another time at the same time, deities were there. It was either Radha Damodar or another almost identical set to Radha Damodar that we had acquired there. They were the medium, about this high, the multi-metal kind, really beautiful deities that we were worshiping there. And we were taking care of the deity worship. And the floor was wooden, and Prabhupada didn't think it was properly clean, and he'd mentioned it, and then when he saw it, he didn't think it was clean enough again. I remember Kaushalya had volunteered to clean the floor in the temple room. Prabhupada said, well, okay, this is how you do it. You're not doing it properly. Do it like this. And Prabhupada pulled his dhoti up and got down on his hands and knees. And he had a pot of water, right, and another pot. He said, get two pots, right? One for dirty water, one for clean water. And he took a rag and he put it in one pot of water. He got down, he scrubbed the floor, right? Then he went to the other pot and he wringed it, then he wringed it out into that, and then he rinsed it, and then he put it in fresh water and put it back down, wring it out, and then went back down and mopped up what he'd done. He said, in this way you will keep one that is clean and one that gets dirtier. And always rinse the rag and then soak up the dirt. That way you'll pick up the dirt rather than just moving it around. But he spent like 2 or 3 minutes down on his hands and knees scrubbing the floor in front of the deities. I remember that was a nice thing to see him do. He didn't hesitate to do it at all. He got right down and showed Koshalya exactly how he wanted it done. So then that night, all the people from the Gita Press showed up for this program. And it was supposed to be a lecture on Vedanta Sutra. A very philosophical topic, right? The one that starts out Janmad Yasya Yato Nwayad or Yataha, and then it becomes the first line in the Srimad Bhagavatam. It's very philosophical. So Prabhupada was speaking about Vedanta Sutra, but very quickly he brought it around to the conclusion that the ultimate knowledge of Vedanta was knowledge of Radha and Krishna, right? And then he quoted the line, the one about Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. And when he was talking about Kunja Bihari, right, which means that they're enjoying in the pleasure groves of Vrindavan, as he talked about Kunja Bihari, he had been speaking for maybe 15 minutes. His eyes closed, and he was sitting up very straight. And he just stopped talking and sitting up very straight. A little tremble was going in his body. And he just sat there for I don't know how many minutes. He just sat quietly for several minutes. And both the Gita Press people, who are actually nice Indian devotees, and ourselves were just spellbound watching him, because we knew that he drifted off into a trance right on the Vyasasana. Sometimes in those days when we were traveling, Prabhupada would be tired, and he would literally doze off while sitting in his seat or waiting on the Vyasasana or something like that. But this time he was sitting up very straight, and there was a little tremor I could see in his body. And after several minutes, while we just sat, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Nobody said anything, nobody moved, everybody just was watching him. After a few minutes, he opened his eyes, and he said, "So this song is very nice. You should all learn to sing this song." And he got up off the Vyasasana and went into his room, and that was the end of the lecture. Dropping back a little bit to one of the cities we were in, and I believe it was in Indore. There was an invitation one night from the Indore Lions Club, I believe it was. They had clubs like they have in the West, the Lions Club. These were local politico businessmen, and they invited us to come for a program. Prabhupada didn't want to go do it, so he called me in. He said, I'm not going to go to this one. He said, I do not like these men. He said, they are snakes. You go and give the lecture. I went, oh my gosh, you know. I said, well, what should I tell them, right? He said, just tell them we are spreading their Hindu religion all over the world, so they're obliged to give us a donation. But before you talk, have a big kirtan, right? Have a good kirtan. You lead it, right? And then you speak, right? He said, if you have a big kirtan first, he said, the chanting, he said, it is our mantra for charming snakes. Then they'll be able to listen for a few minutes without arguing and try to get them to agree to give a donation and go. So he said it is our mantra for charming snakes. Prabhupada walked in the room, and he just looked at the situation of the preparations, and he stopped. He said, what is this? Where are the fruits? Where are the flowers? I cannot believe this. He said, I think this initiation ceremony is a farce. I cannot bring the Lord of the universe into a place like this. Why have you not decorated nicely? What is this? What are these things? There were stainless steel hotel pans for bathing the deities in. You know, the rectangular they call hotel pans. They were the best the devotees had to come up with, but Prabhupada was totally dissatisfied. Totally dissatisfied. He started to rage. He stood there for a long time chastising Nanda Kumara, chastising Shamsundar, chastising Akoyanana, one or the other, one after the other. Then he said, I am not going to do it. I do not think this is simply, I cannot do it. You have not done nicely. This is not, there should be flowers and fruit everywhere. Everything should be much, no, I cannot do it. I'm leaving. Then he stopped. And he kind of hesitated. Then he got up on the Vyasasana and said, all right, I will do it, but I do not think this is very nice. And this was all right on TV. He didn't pay the slightest bit of it. He was shouting for, it must have gone on, I think it might have gone on for 10 minutes. He just dressed all three of them up and down one side and up and down the other. It was just incredible. And I was shaking. I was thinking, boy, I'm lucky that I wasn't in charge of any of the arrangements. Then he said, all right, so it was a kirtan, and then he said, all right, Revatinandana Maharaj, you do the fire sacrifice. Now, Pradyumna was there, and I had assumed that he was going to do the fire sacrifice, because he always did them, right, when he was there. But I think maybe because it was a Koyananda sannyas unexpectedly. Unexpectedly, I was called upon to do it. Now, I'd already been doing some of these, both marriages and deity installation ceremonies in London, but I hadn't done one in months. However, I knew all the prayers and mantras. So I thought, well, I sat down to do it, right? I just had to start functioning. And at least luckily, I thought luckily I know very well the Mangalacharana prayer, so at least I can chant the mantras, and I knew the one about Oma Povitra Pavitro Va Sarva Vastam Gatopi Va Yaksmared Punarikaksham Shabaya Bhyantara Suchi. So I started in, and as I started doing the Bande Ham Shri Guru Shri Juta, having everybody repeat it, every time I would break syllables in the words. Like, for example, where does one divide the one word that is Shri Varsavanavi Devi Dayitayan Kripabdaye? It all shows as one word in the songbook. Where does that break up into syllables? You have to know Sanskrit in order to be able to properly divide it into smaller groups of their compound words. But Prabhupada had already told us in India not to spend time studying Sanskrit other than to learn it as we did classes. And so I wasn't a Sanskrit scholar. I was forbidden to do it, actually, because he wanted us to be preaching in India. So anyway, every time I would make a mistake, Prabhupada would interrupt me. And he would say, no, it is not like that. It is like this. And he would show the correct division of the words into syllables. But I had to continue to keep on going, and every time I made a mistake, which were inevitable mistakes, because I did not know Sanskrit, Goravir Bhava Bhumes Thum is one word, right? Etc., right? So where to break it up into syllables? And every time I made a mistake, I got chastised. And the more he chastised me, the more nervous and upset I got. Because it was like all of a sudden I was on the firing line. And his mood was intense that afternoon. I've never seen him like that, personally, that angry, right? and so finally, in my confusion, I skipped over I got through to Namo Mahabharanaya, and I skipped it. And I started into Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu, and Prabhupada said, no, you have forgotten Namo Mahabharanaya. All right, I will finish these mantras. And then he concluded the mantra chanting, much to my relief, right? Then the rest of it went basically okay, right? Prabhupada had this sour look on his face most of the time, but then he gave a Koyananda his sannyas. A Koyananda was standing there. Besides taking sannyas, which is serious enough, he was had just been chastised very heavily. And he was holding the danda, and his teeth were clenched, and he was shaking. So finally, when it was all over, and one more thing, afterward, the mantras are chanted a second time the way Prabhupada did an initiation. While the fire is made, the mantras are chanted again. And then the ghee and grains are put with the shwaha, and the bananas are put, right? So while Prabhupada chanted the mantras, I was doing the fire, because I was sitting right there at the sand, right? So, what happened is, as I was doing it, I started feeding sticks into the fire with my right hand and had the ladle in my left hand. And I was pouring ghee. And as I held up the ladle, I realized, oops, it's supposed to be in my right hand. And I switched hands, and Prabhupada was looking at me as I did it, and he went like this. Because, again, I'm left-handed, right? And I had I was using the wrong hand to pour the ghee on the fire, and I had to switch it, and he was watching me do it. And he made this really disgusted look on his face. So finally, when that was over, he said, all right. He pointed at me, he said, begin kirtan. I started leading a kirtan. Prabhupada looked over to Koinanna, who was still standing there like this. And Prabhupada looked at him, and for the first time in that afternoon, he smiled a little bit. And he went like this to Koinanna, looking at him, meaning dance. Get your body moving, loosen up a little bit, right? He was pleased with his seriousness and also wanted him to get into the swing of the kirtan. It wasn't that serious, you know what I mean? Or he should enjoy Krishna consciousness also. I thought that was clear from his facial expression. It's the first time he smiled all day. Then he got, after it was over, the place totally packed, he got up and went to the back door to leave, and when he got to the back door, the car hadn't gotten there yet. And he had to stand in a little drizzle of rain for a few minutes, and the crowd was so packed in behind him that he couldn't even fit back inside. And he was just standing there like this in the rain. He got into the car, and he asked Nanda Kumara, "So, you have brought my prasadam?" Now, he was taking simpler prasadam by that time. And Nanda Kumara said, "Well, Prabhupada, I thought you would take your usual prasadam since it's not as rich." He said, "No, this is a deity installation. I want Mahaprasadam." So Nanda Kumara, he said, "Go and get me a plate." So Nanda Kumara went back in, came out with a plate of Maha, and they drove Prabhupada off. And Nanda Kumara told me, a little later on in the afternoon, when they arrived at Prabhupada's apartment, the car stopped, Prabhupada's plate of prasadam fell off the back seat and landed face down on the floor of the back seat of the car, which one can simply assume was what the floor of a back seat of a car is usually like, not perfectly clean, right? And Nanda Kumara went, "Oh no," to himself. And when Prabhupada went upstairs, he said, I was hoping Prabhupada would forget about his prasadam, but the first thing he said was, "Where is my prasadam? Bring me my prasadam." And he said, "Prabhupada, it fell on the floor." Prabhupada said, "Bring it." And Nanda Kumara picked it off the floor, put it back on the plate, and brought it to him. He said, Prabhupada ate the whole plate. Right? Again, it probably had dirt and whatnot in it, and Prabhupada ate it all anyway, because it was prasadam. He said, "Ribati, you're into philosophy. You know what Prabhupada said the other day?" I said, "What?" He said, Prabhupada said that sometimes even after going back to Godhead, a soul could fall again. And I said, "Are you sure?" Because I knew a lot of Bhagavad Gita, and there's a couple of verses in the Gita where Krishna says, "Having returned to my transcendental abode, one never returns to this world of miseries," etc. There's several verses. I think there's 3 different verses that mention never returns if one completes the business, right? So he said, "Well, you can ask him yourself, but I'll guarantee you that's what he said." So when I got a chance to go into Prabhupada's room, it was after he woke up from a nap. And Nana had just put a garland on him, and there were several devotees in the room. And I asked if I could ask a question, and he said yes. And I said, "Is it true that just recently you've been talking about how sometimes even having gone back to Godhead, a soul sometimes falls again into the material energy?" And Prabhupada said yes. And I said, "Well, how does that relate with what the Gita says when it says never?" And Prabhupada smiled a little bit, and he said, actually, he said, "Never means practically never." Okay, that's what he said. Never means practically never. And he smiled a little bit, kind of a wise, meditative smile. And he said, because really we are eternally the same. So marginal means that there is that capacity to turn away or turn toward. So sometime it might happen. Of course, generally a soul does not fall. And even if he does, he probably wouldn't do it again, but it is not inconceivable, right? That's what he said. Again, it relates to the same issue, because some people say that souls never fall away in the first place, or they fall from somewhere else besides Krishna's association. Well, this was definitely about being back to Godhead, as it describes it in the Bhagavad Gita, back to Krishna's abode. So those are some relevant points that I thought might be interesting to record. I was in Prabhupada's room one time, and there was nobody else there, so I said, "I wanted to ask you, Srila Prabhupada, when we're out traveling, a lot of the time we stay up late with the students. If they're going to stay late and ask questions into the night, we stay up with them, because we probably won't see them again. And sometimes they're very sincere. So we're occasionally up until 12 o'clock midnight or 2 in the morning after a program, preaching, talking with students." He said, "How do you do?" He was concerned about the book distribution, whether it was being done right, and I said, "Well, we place your books as the altar pieces, because we use the Krishna book as Radha Krishna, and your picture is on the back of it, and we have a Panchatatva painting. Then we have kirtan, and I give a lecture, and we have more kirtan. We give up prasadam. We invite the students to come and look at the books and talk to us. He said, he smiled as he started smiling as I was talking. He said, oh, that is very nice. He said, if you just continue to do just like that. He told me, it does not matter how many books you distribute, because your program is different. It will attract devotees. So he specifically said, quote, it does not matter how many books you distribute. He said, as long as you're presenting them nicely, which we were doing. Right? So he was actually real pleased. And I said, well, I'm a little worried because sometimes we get to bed real late. We get up 6 hours later. We're not up for a Mangala Artik, or we're not up by 4 o'clock in the morning, so we're not really following the exact sadhana. And Prabhupada was still smiling. He said, that is all right. He said, because you are doing Sankirtan, he said, that will be fine. He said, then he told me something. He said, I have written in my books that our movement runs on 2 tracks, which are called the Pancharatriki Bidhi and the Bhagavad Bidhi. He said the Pancharatriki Bidhi means the rules and regulations of deity worship, and our temple sadhana is centered around it. Because of the Mangala Artik, etc. It sets all of our time of activities and like that. Right? And it's very valuable for devotees to become strong, right? By being regulated. He said the Bhagavad Bidhi is simply chanting, dancing, feasting, and philosophy. And it is Lord Chaitanya's process. That is really what Lord Chaitanya came to propagate. He said after, when he instructed the Goswamis to write, they produced books which, he said they added some modes of worship from the previous age mode of worship, which was deity worship, in order to make the process appear more Vedic to the Smarta Brahmin community in India, who were otherwise criticizing Lord Chaitanya, that we do not find this in the Vedas. So to make it appear more Vedic, he said they added certain things, and that is what we call the Pancharatriki Bidhi, right? So even though I say in my books that our movement runs on 2 tracks and they are both equally important, he said, I will tell you that that if you can get along without the Pancharatriki Bidhi in this age if necessary, but you cannot get along without the Bhagavad Bidhi. This is why your Sankirtan activity is sustaining you even without the regulation of the regular deity worship. He said, so if a devotee needs to be strengthened, then send him to the temple or return him to the temple, but otherwise the Sankirtan will be all you need. And then he told me, do not preach like this. Do not speak like this. And I said, why? Because I was all ready to run out and start singing. I thought it was wonderful what he explained to me. And he said, no, he said, many devotees are attached to the deities and the deity worship in a very sentimental way, which is helping them to be attached to Krishna consciousness. And if you explain like this, they may mistake it that you are criticizing the deity worship, right? Or the deity, that it is less important or unimportant, right? So therefore, do not preach like this. I'm explaining this to you for your own understanding of priorities, in other words, which was very nice of him. So when it was over, I talked with, I think Shamsundar Mukund, or rather Nanda Kumara were there. I said, maybe I should go over to Prabhupada's apartment just on behalf of the devotees and apologize. Because we all thought that it was the worst disaster day we'd ever seen as far as our service was concerned. So I got a ride over, and I asked Nanda Kumara, is Prabhupada still up? And he said, yes. He said, can I see him? I said, well, put your head in and see if he'll see you. And when I put my head around the door, and Prabhupada looked at me, and I said, can I come in? And he said, yes, come on. So I came in and I sat down at his feet after offering obeisances, and I said, Srila Prabhupada, on behalf of all the devotees, I just wanted to apologize because we did it so badly, and we know it was just so, we're sorry to have displeased you so much. Prabhupada smiled at me a little bit, and he said, do not pay it any mind. I'm almost positive that's what he said, do not pay it any mind. And I was really amazed because he was as cool as a cucumber. So a question came to me. I said, And I knew from experience in India and other places never to refer to Prabhupada as an example of a pure devotee to his face. Because when I did it one time in India, he said, I am not a pure devotee, I am a rascal. With great vehemence he said it. Right, so I said, Prabhupada, can you answer me a question about the consciousness of a pure devotee? And he said, yes. Well, he said, ask. So I said, sometimes it appears that a pure devotee may be very angry, or that he may be happy, right? And yet, how does that really affect him, right? Because I was thinking, now he doesn't seem upset even slightly, right? So Prabhupada answered like this, basically. He said, the consciousness of a pure devotee is very, very deep. He said, it is like the ocean. So the ocean, on the surface of the ocean, near the surface, there may be so many waves that are kicked up. But as you go down even a few feet into the ocean, you will find out it is very still. Right? He said, and I understood what he was saying immediately. So in other words, so he said, in this way, the consciousness of a pure devotee is so deep that nothing really disturbs it. He said, there may be some ripples on the surface, but underneath it remains very, very deep and still. And I said, is it like that even at death? And he said, yes.
Krishna Kirtan Gana Anilo Premadana Karuna Prachu